Okay, I've been watching a lot of news archives on the various conflicts that have raged in the Central African Basin, the Congo Basin, and these conflicts are heavily overlapped. But, for example, a country like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is vast, and there's various insurgencies going on. The M23 rebellion, the insurgency in Ituri province in North Kivu. Then there's the Lord's Resistance Army campaign in Uganda. Um, and a lot of these conflicts overlap, involving pretty much all the countries in the region. In fact, the Second Congo War has been known as the Great War of Africa or Africa's World War. That conflict cumulatively from 1998 has cost somewhere in the region of 5.4 million lives plus. And most of that is from illness, disease, and other conditions that were exacerbated by the war. So that's not actually violent deaths, but still, that makes it the deadliest conflict since World War II. Far deadlier than some better documented conflicts. So that region is really scarred. It seems very difficult, or it seems that it would take a very, very long time for anything to rebuild there to a point of normality. Although, having said that, Rwanda, like I said in the previous video, is developing very fast, and it's even been called a potential Singapore of Africa, which would be incredible. That would truly be a remarkable story, from a dirt poor country which suffered the worst genocide of modern times to go to such a wealthy little hub would be incredible. And Paul Kagame would have to get some credit for that. But anyway, I want to talk about a very specific issue, and I imagine this will cause some controversy, but I think it has to be said. And I want to talk about African on African racism. So, before I get into this, what is racism? Well, to me, a basic definition of racism would be holding prejudice or hatred against another person because of their ethnicity. Now, some people will say, oh, well, Africans are all black, so how can they be racist against each other? Um, if we have in the UK, for example, a Polish or Romanian person who suffers animosity, there's some debate over whether that's racism or xenophobia. Either way, it's wrong, but that's because they're white, they're Caucasian people. But we've also heard debates about the Irish traveller community and whether that can be considered racism or not. Of course, there's also arguments to be made that where they settle there is often trouble, and I'm not going to get deeply into that one. It's I think there's valid points on both sides, but regarding racism in Africa, well, then people will say, "Oh yeah, sure, South Africa apartheid," and that's obviously a very prominent example of white supremacy. I was watching an interview last night with the late Eugene Terre-Blanche, the Boer militants leader, who he was interviewed by Louis Theroux, and he was a well-known hard man and white supremacist. I mean, that's what it was. There's no question about it. But got me thinking about these issues of race in Africa. And firstly, it goes without saying, Africa is a huge continent, the second largest continent. 56 countries, hundreds, if not thousands, of ethnic groups. I mean, Nigeria alone has hundreds. And it's true that many people in sub-Saharan Africa speak Bantu languages or languages related to Bantu, the Bantu family of languages, but there is enormous diversity in Africa. And I feel often what Pan-Africanists do is they present the history of Africa solely through the memories of colonialism. Now, I understand that, and I will always, always acknowledge the exploitation that Europeans were guilty of. Not just exploitation, but cruelty. I mean, Leopold II's rule in the Belgian Congo from 1886 to 1908, in my view, ranks him as one of the worst tyrants in history. In fact, in terms of mortality, he would rank fourth after Mao, Stalin, and Hitler, fourth in modern times in terms of overall mortality. Um, and that's obviously extreme white supremacy. But in today's context, in the post colonial era, I mean, most African countries gained their independence in the 50s and 60s, early 70s. So when we're looking at the issue of race, actually, the most virulent, the most prominent, and certainly the most deadly example of racist violence in modern times was probably the Rwanda genocide. Why? Because, yes, the Hutus and Tutsis were black people, but there were, certainly from the point of the Hutu extremists, racial differences. So that would definitely fit the definition of racism. Maybe not in terms of skin pigmentation, but in terms of ethnic background. And what happened in Rwanda, whilst it definitely should be covered and get attention, that's actually only one example of Hutu Tutsi violence. There were two other genocides in the region, in Burundi, 1972 and 1993, and those are far less documented than the Rwanda genocide, but they were also pretty costly, costing tens of thousands of lives, both of them. Again, that related to the Hutu Tutsi schism. But in other parts of Africa, there's other examples. On religious grounds, of course, in Nigeria, there's long running Christian Muslim tensions, which I think somewhat comparable to India in terms of the sporadic pogroms and the sporadic violence we see. And over the last 10 years, it's been the Boko Haram insurgency. In other areas, it's violence along linguistic grounds. In Cameroon, there is very real tensions now between the Anglophile minority and the French-speaking majority, as I understand it. I think that's the balance of power. But clearly, there is a lot of racial-based violence in Africa. I mean, in recent years, people have been burned alive, lynched alive. Some of the worst violence during the struggle in South Africa was black on black, when alleged informants or alleged white collaborators with the white majority, had that horrible practice of necklacing, where they would be chased, have a tire put around their neck, the tire would be covered in petrol, and they would be burned alive. I watched archive earlier from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it showed a guy who had been burned alive. Um, and this was again related to the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide. I mean, that didn't end in 1994. There's still killings going on in the eastern DRC related to the Rwanda genocide. There's still Hutu Tutsi animosity. And I don't think it will ever reach that scale again, not in my lifetime, but there is a chance of violence breaking out again, which would definitely damage Rwanda's ambition and would be a tragedy. I think there's really, really deeply entrenched ethnic hatreds in that part of the world. In other parts of Africa, there's been xenophobic violence against foreigners in South Africa in recent years. And again, that's black on black. For example, violence against West African migrant workers in South Africa. So there are many, many examples of this. And I haven't even spoken about the oceans of blood spilt by African dictators. Some of them are well known, like Idi Amin and Muammar Gaddafi, but there's others that were pretty sadistic and whose regimes were responsible for thousands of deaths but are not household names. I'll give an example. Toure in Gambia, excuse me, in Guinea. See, even I'm getting that mixed up, and I looked this up the other night. Um, his regime may have been responsible for up to 50,000 deaths from 1958 to 1984. Um, Gambia or Guinea, I can't even remember. I think it was Gambia actually. Apologies if I made a mistake there, but that's what I'm talking about. This just isn't documented. It's just not known as much as it perhaps should be. So when I hear Pan Africanists constantly hark back to imperial wrongs, I understand it on some level because Europe definitely made a lot of its wealth through exploiting Africa. Definitely. But Pan Africanists, time and time again, have made excuses for African dictators because they've been so blinded by the notion of them as liberators that they just turn a blind eye to their excesses and their human rights abuses against Africans. And whilst there has been backlash against white people in Africa, for example, we've heard about farm grabs in Zimbabwe and South Africa against white farmers, which is awful, and there were Westerners killed during the Congo crisis of the 60s. The vast majority of deaths in Africa are black on black. And yet, media coverage of racism is so often through the prism of the American civil rights movement and what happened in the United States in the past. And I'm not saying racism's gone. I'm not saying that white supremacy isn't a very real problem in the world. It is. And I have total contempt for it. But I'm just making the point that within Africa, I mean, the fundamental argument of Pan-Africanists of African unity is a good one because it's, that would be a bridge to address these problems. But where I take issue with them is where they blame everything on outsiders and won't take some responsibility, and they will not condemn African dictators. Of course, the exact situation in every country is different. I mean, the North African countries, take for example Sudan. The Darfur conflict can be described as, again, there's racial components there. The Arab Janjaweed murdering black Africans in Darfur. In Libya, during the outbreak of the Libyan civil war in 2011, there were severe human rights abuses perpetrated against black Africans, um, although many of them have been brought in as mercenaries for collapsing Gaddafi. In West Africa, there's very real tensions in Mali. Recently, there was a massacre of Fulani herdsmen by the Dogon sect. So I would argue far more people have died in the half century roughly of African independence than in any conflicts with Europeans, with the exception of the Belgian Congo. I mean, take for example the Zulu War. The total deaths of that conflict were a few thousand. Now that is a blip compared to what's been happening in the Congo Basin over the last 30 years. So I think that African on African racism is a very, very real issue, and simply blaming foreigners, as Pan-Africanists often do, isn't the answer. Pan-Africanists need to decide what exactly they want. If they really want democracy, they need to start calling out brutal dictators, and they need to condemn racism wherever it is, and not show favoritism to one group of people over another. These are really, really important issues. And of course, we can't talk about Africa like it's one model. There's different situations in every country. But as a general rule, I think African on African racism is a very, very real problem, specifically black on black African racism or Arab on black African racism. And yes, white on black or black on white racism is a big problem in southern Africa, but the continent as a whole, I would say the bulk of violence in the last 50 years has been black on black, and we are talking millions and millions dead in the numerous bloody conflicts that have happened there. I mean, Somalia, 500,000 dead. The first and second Sudanese civil wars, probably 2.5 million dead. In the DRC, like I say, the second Congo war, over 5 million dead. The Rwanda genocide, 1 million dead. The two Burundi genocides, 500,000 dead. The Liberian civil wars, about 300,000 dead. Um, the Angola and Mozambique civil wars, close to 1 million dead in each of those. The Portuguese colonial war, which was the fragments of the Portuguese Empire, thousands dead in that. But that's just a snapshot of what's been going. 100,000 dead in Algeria. These are all incredibly bloody conflicts, and even today we're seeing protests against Bashir regime in Sudan, which is good. It's always good to see people rising up against dictators, but I just hope that doesn't escalate into a civil war. Um, in Libya, watching that situation closely, Colonel Haftar's rebellion, be interesting to see what happens there. So there's a lot going on. Some people might look at this and say that I'm only looking at Africa in one light. Well, there is good things going on in Africa as well, and I agree those things should be covered. But there is also real savagery and real brutality and real cruelty. I mean, when we're talking about women being mass raped in the Congo Basin as kind of tools of conquest, when we're talking about, and people are utterly desensitized, I mean, seeing some Hutu rebels talking about trying to justify the rape of women was stomach churning. Anyway, I'll leave it there. The Ugandan Bush War is another one. Throughout the 1980s, up to 500,000 dead.